My nonprofit organization shut down because the council wouldn't fund it, so I went homeless. While living on the streets, I ran into an old college friend, and he helped me turn my life around. I grew up in a very dysfunctional family, and art was my way to escape reality when dad was being physical with my mom. So when I was 27, I set up a small business where I taught art to children from low-income families as a way to provide what I wish I had. I'd decorate my classroom in the most welcoming way possible, and I'd always make sure to bring in drinks, sandwiches, and snacks for kids. However, the art center was not sustainable. Every single one of my classes was completely free, so I relied on funding from the council and donations to keep the lights on. Unfortunately, after a few years of running the center, people became less interested. My classes, which once had 15 or 20 kids, now had 5, and thus the council deemed that the art center was no longer worthy of funding. Perhaps it was a bad decision on my part, but I never worked a job as I always made enough from donations and funding to get by, but without it, I was lost. I fell behind on bills quickly and had no savings to fall back on. I became homeless at 31. I found myself sitting on the curb with my belongings, wondering how I had gone from helping others to needing help myself. As I sat there on the curb, I wondered how I ended up in this situation. I had always been the one others turned to in times of need. Now I was the one who needed help, and I didn't know where to begin. I tried to think of a solution, but all I could feel was overwhelmed and feeling like I had failed so many people, including myself. I didn't want to burden my friends by asking to stay with them, but with no other options, I called my close friend, Sarah. She was one of the few people who knew just how much the community center had meant to me. When she heard about my situation, she didn't hesitate to offer her couch. I stayed with her for a few weeks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was intruding. Sarah tried to comfort me, telling me that things would get better, but I found it hard to believe her. Each day felt like an uphill battle as I applied for jobs. I continued to face rejection after rejection. My savings were depleted, and I had no income. The reality of my situation was sinking in, and it was terrifying. After a few weeks, I decided it was time to move on. I couldn't live with Sarah forever, and needed to figure out my next steps. With nowhere else to go, I began sleeping in my car. At first, it wasn't so bad. I told myself it was only temporary, and that I'd find a job soon and get back on my feet. But as the days turned into weeks and months, my optimism faded. Living in my car was a humbling experience. I quickly learned to navigate the world of homelessness. I found the best places to park without being noticed, where to find a public restroom, and how to stretch a few dollars as far as they would go. I spent my days job hunting, filling out applications, and attending interviews that rarely led anywhere. One cold night, as I laid shivering in the backseat of my car, I realized I couldn't go on like this much longer. I needed a break, something to take my mind off of everything. That's when I remembered the hiking trails in the mountains just outside the city. Nature had always been a source of comfort for me, and I decided that the next morning I'd drive up to the mountains and spend the day hiking. The drive to the mountains was bittersweet. I couldn't help but think of how I used to take the kids from the community center on nature walks, teaching them about the plants and animals we encountered. But as I made my way up the mountain road, the fresh air and sight of trees started to lift my spirits. I parked my car at the trailhead and set off on foot. I could feel the tension in my body begin to ease. The beauty of the forest felt like a distraction from my troubles. I walked for hours. As the sun began to set, I found a small clearing by a river. I felt a sense of peace for the first time in what felt like forever. I decided to make the clearing my temporary home. I set up a makeshift camp using the few supplies I had in my car. The days that followed were some of the most peaceful I had experienced in years. I spent my time fishing in the river, gathering wild berries, and exploring the surrounding woods. I found solace in the simplicity of my new life. It felt good to be removed from the chaos of the city for a while, but as much as I wanted to stay forever, I knew it wasn't a permanent solution. Winter was approaching, and the mountains would soon be covered in snow. I needed to return to the city and find a way to rebuild my life. The thought of leaving the woods was daunting, but I knew I couldn't hide from reality forever. I packed up my makeshift camp and made my way back to the city. I wasn't sure what I would do next, but I was determined to keep going. The time I had spent in the mountains had given me a new perspective. I realized that even though I had lost everything, I still had the strength to start over. When I returned to the city, I found that not much had changed. The streets were just as crowded, the people just as busy, but I was different. I threw myself back into the job hunt and took on any work I could find. I washed dishes in a diner, cleaned houses, and even did some landscaping work. The jobs were physically demanding and paid little, but they kept me afloat. I still didn't have a permanent place to live, but I found a small sense of stability. One afternoon, after a long shift at the diner, I decided to treat myself to a cup of coffee at a nearby cafe. I was exhausted both physically and mentally. As I sat down with my coffee, I heard a voice call my name. I looked up and was surprised to see someone I hadn't seen in years. It was David, an old friend from college. David and I were close during our college years. We were both involved in various volunteer projects, and I remembered how passionate and driven he was back then. Seeing him again after all these years was a shock, but it also brought back a flood of memories. David looked just as surprised to see me, and after a moment of awkward silence, he asked how I had been. I didn't know how to answer that question. How do you explain to someone that your life had fallen apart, that you were homeless and barely scraping by? But something in his eyes made me trust him, and before I knew it, I spilled all the tea. I told him about the community center, how it had been my dream, and how losing it had shattered me. I told him about the struggles I had faced since then. The nights spent sleeping in my car or on park benches, the days of endless job hunting with little to show for it. I expected him to look at me with the same kind of detached sympathy that so many others had, but David didn't do that. He listened and offered to help me when I was finished. At first, I was hesitant to accept his help. I had been so determined to do this on my own, but David was persistent. He told me that he was doing well in his company and wanted to give back. He assured me that his offer wasn't out of pity, but out of a genuine desire to help out. After some convincing, I finally agreed. David helped me find a part-time job at the company where he worked, doing data entry in the office. It wasn't the kind of work I had imagined myself doing, but it was steady, and it paid enough to cover my basic expenses. For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Working at the office was an adjustment. The routine was different from anything I had done before, and I often felt out of place among my well-dressed professional coworkers. But I focused on the work. I was determined to prove that I was capable and reliable. David was there every step of the way. He often encouraged and supported me whenever I needed it. As the weeks went by, David and I started spending more time together outside of work. We'd grab coffee after our shifts, reminisce about our college days, and talk about our lives. He was kind and patient, and he never made me feel like a charity case. He often told me he admired my strength despite everything I had been through. It wasn't long before I began to admire David too, not just for his kindness, but for believing in me. Soon enough, I found myself falling for him. I looked forward to our coffee breaks and really any moment when it was just the two of us. One evening, David invited me to dinner at his place after work. I hesitated at first because I was unsure if I was ready for what that invitation might mean, but I agreed. That evening was a turning point for both of us. We cooked together, reminisced about old times, and shared stories from our lives. It was simple, but it felt right. Sitting there with him, I realized just how much I had come to care for him. As the night went on, we sat on the couch, talking long after the meal was finished. Our conversation went quiet, and his voice sounded more intimate, and eventually, there was nothing left to say. We sat in silence for a moment, and then, without thinking, I leaned in and kissed him. After that night, David became my anchor. He had been my source of strength during a time when I had almost given up. He encouraged me to pursue my passion for art again. I hadn't even considered this since the community center had closed. With his support, I started teaching private art classes in the evenings. Just a few kids at first, but it felt amazing to be doing what I loved again. Slowly, I began to rebuild my life. The job at David's company gave me the stability I needed, while the art classes gave me a sense of purpose. I saved up enough money to rent a small studio apartment, and it wasn't much, but it was mine. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future. The new studio apartment was tiny, but it was a place where I could finally breathe and start over. I decorated it with the few belongings I had left, adding splashes of color wherever I could. The walls were soon covered in art supplies and sketches, and it started to feel like a real home. As I settled into my new life, I began to think about the future and what I wanted to do next. The idea of opening another community center seemed impossible, given everything that had happened. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to find a way to give back again. The kids from the old center were always in the back of my mind, and I knew I couldn't move forward without knowing that I did everything in my power to help them. Eventually, with David's help, I was able to open a new, smaller art studio in the community. It wasn't the same as the old center, but it was something. I started teaching art to kids again. I helped them express themselves and find their voices, just like I had always wanted. It was hard work, and there were plenty of challenges along the way, but I knew I was on the right path. I remembered one boy from my old center, Jacob. He never spoke. He just sat in the corner, watching the other kids. But then, one day, he picked up a paintbrush and started to paint. What he created was incredible. It was an abstract landscape that had the potential to be in a gallery. I encouraged him to keep going, and over time, he began to open up. He started talking to the other kids and making friends. It was like watching a flower bloom right before my eyes. It felt bittersweet to have had that experience and have been that guidance at my old center for these kids. The kids who came to the new studio were different from the ones at the old center. Most of them came from better-off families, and they didn't face the same struggles, but they still needed a place to express themselves. I began teaching and creating new lessons and projects that would inspire them. Watching their faces light up when they created something they were proud of reminded me why I had started the community center in the first place. place. Through it all, David was there for me, supporting me in every way he could. We both had our own struggles, but together, we found a way to move forward. Our love grew stronger each day. Looking back now, I realized that losing everything was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to let go of my pride, to accept help, and to open my heart to love. I never would have met David if I hadn't gone through those tough times, and now, I'm stronger for it. We still talk about that chance meeting in the cafe and how it changed both of our lives. It's funny how life works sometimes. The most unexpected moments can lead to the greatest blessings. And every day, I'm reminded that no matter how dark things may seem, there's always a light at the end of the tunnel.